Thank you all for being here. I want to tell you that you're going to hear from a person who I have respected greatly, a person who gives me the measure of what it means to be a leader in the world, on working on important things. And I think you're going to enjoy his talk and his view very much. The reason that I think it's important for him to be here at MIT is the following. He is a person who worries about humanitarian problems, about disunity in the world, people who are suffering. In my government service, I observed very closely many, many cases where people were suffering in the world and not anybody was paying attention. It's important at MIT that we pay some attention to the suffering which is going on around the world and what we can do to help alleviate it. So we will learn from his conversation here today, and I ask him, please come to the podium.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much, John. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's still afternoon on British time. I think afternoon. It's just after tea rather than dinner time. But it's very nice to be back in Cambridge, and especially to be here at MIT. It's sort of more or less the Stone Age when I was here, rather a long time ago. But it's still nice to be back. And the way this is going to work, I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes. And John and I are going to have 10, 15 minutes conversation, and then you're going to have to sing for your supper with some brilliant questions. As you hinted, Professor, sadly, this is a very good time to be discussing the New World disorder, because it's far clearer that disorder marks the state of the world rather than order. This time last week, I was in Beirut. I was in Beirut on Wednesday and Thursday last week, and I was in Damascus and Homs in Syria on Monday and Tuesday of last week. Those two countries are typical of the places that increasingly mark the humanitarian suffering that John Deutch referred to. And they're places of, over the years, extreme political failure. In my previous life, I spent time trying to pursue diplomatic solutions. Now I work in the places where politics has failed. These are countries marked by high levels of external military interference, sometimes attack, but also sometimes sponsorship of different factions. They're places marked by high and growing levels of poverty, and in some cases extreme poverty. And they're places marked by extremely high numbers of refugees and internally displaced people. In other words, those who are forcibly displaced as a result of conflict. Sadly, Syria and Lebanon are not atypical today. There are 60 conflicts going on around the world, and most of them do not fit into the categorization of either the US-Israel-Iran conflict of the last 4.5, 5 weeks, or the Ukraine-Russia conflict, both of which are marked by contest between state actors. The vast bulk of the 60 conflicts that I'm going to talk about today are, I mean, the word is a really bad one, civil wars. They're internal conflicts within a country. There's nothing civil about them, but they're taking place within the territorial boundaries of a state. And as you, I'm sure, know, the Syria case, a prototypical case of a government at war with its own people. I'm going to throw quite a lot of statistics at you. There'll be a short test at the end for you to get out of the room. So please make mental or physical notes as you go through. But I think that the data does actually matter. So 60 wars going on around the world, and actually 61 now with the Iran conflict. 120 million people forcibly displaced by conflict. So more or less 45 to 50 million of them are refugees. That means they've crossed the border of their own state and gone into a neighboring state or gone further afield. And then the remaining 70 million or so internally displaced. Syria is a good example both of refugee flow, so 7 million Syrians from a population of 24 million in 2011 fled the country. And within Syria, 8 million were moved within the country. They were internally displaced. But other countries that have been marked by high levels of refugee flow, Venezuela in Latin America, Ukraine, obviously, very significant case study. Sudan is the world's worst humanitarian crisis, which I'll come back to in the course of my remarks. Sudan, a country of 45 million people. I think I saw the figure in some papers in the office yesterday, 14.5, 15 million people forcibly displaced by the violence, 4.5, 5 million of them across borders to countries that have trouble meeting the needs of their own people. So South Sudan, Chad, most notably. 120 million displaced by conflict, 240 million people in humanitarian need. That means they depend on aid agencies to survive. Their governments are not able to support them. 170 million people living at crisis levels or worse of malnutrition. And I just want to explain why I'm going to focus on that. There are 5 levels of malnutrition. Catastrophic, which is famine. Emergency, level 4. So 5 is famine. 4 is emergency, 3 is crisis. 170 million live at crisis levels of, or above, levels of malnutrition. And the reason I want to just pause on that for a moment is that in the places that I've got to know in the 10 or 12 years that I've been leading the International Rescue Committee, when there is acute malnutrition, you can guarantee that everything else is going wrong as well. So the health services are broken, the economy is broken, there are extreme levels of violence against women and girls. You can guarantee that the systems of sustenance have broken down. I talk about acute malnutrition being the apex of the humanitarian pyramid. And just to put it in a slightly wider context, 800 million people, so 10% of the world's population, live on less than $3 a day. So that's the definition of extreme poverty. The biggest point I want you to take away this evening is that the distribution of that 10%, those 800 million people, is radically different than what it was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, the vast bulk of the extreme poor lived in countries like China and India, which were relatively stable states but had high levels of poverty. And so the debate about, quote unquote, development was about how can a country develop an economy that can support its own people, and how does aid support those countries when in the transition. Today, we're in a radically different position for the following reason. 60% of the extreme poor in the world live in what are called fragile and conflict-affected states. So it's not the Chinas and Indias of this world, it's the Sudans of this world, it's the South Sudans of this world, it's the Afghanistans of this world, it's the Gazas of this world. And this transformation in the geography of poverty, I want you to try and have in mind, but also have in mind that the ways in which local, national, and international systems can address that poverty also has to radically change. Because in very stylized form, if you think about it, if there are very large numbers of poor people in stable countries where there is a government at local or national level, then there's an obvious route to getting to the people and addressing their needs. And essentially what were called the Millennium Development Goals that were inaugurated in the year 2000, they showed success by working through government institutions. But in a situation where 60% of the extreme poor are in fragile and conflict states, where the government is not in control, so in parts of northern Nigeria, in parts of Somalia, in parts of, in Gaza as a prime example, in parts of Sudan, the government is not in control. In fact, 200 million people live in areas of the world that are controlled by non-state armed groups. So the government's either not present, or it's at war with its own people, so people won't go to government centers because they fear that they're going to be persecuted, or government is just weak and corrupt. So the strategies for reaching those people has to change radically to make a difference in these what are called fragile and conflict-affected states. Here's the problem. If you take the model I've given you, 1990, vast majority of the world's poor living in stable states, aid trying to develop economies that worked. Today, 60% living in fragile and conflict-affected states. If you take that model, at the moment, the global aid system is still structured as if we're living in the 1990 version of the distribution of poverty, not the 2026 distribution of poverty. I wish I had it with me, but we publish at the International Rescue Committee every December what we call our emergency watch list, which is the list of the top 20 countries at risk of humanitarian catastrophe in the year ahead. It's a data-driven research publication, 74 indicators. Sudan, number 1 on that list. 11 African countries out of the top 20. Interestingly, Syria and Lebanon were on our top 20, even though we published in December, because we feared what was coming. The data that we were looking at made us fear what was coming. But here's the point I want you to think about. Those 20 countries account for 12% of the global population, so quite low, but 90% of the people in humanitarian need. So the concentration of poverty is very, very high. In these mainly fragile and conflict-affected states, I'll come back with a little caveat on that in a moment. But guess how much of the global aid system goes to those 20 countries where 90% of the people in humanitarian need live? You'll guess when I said that the aid system still reflects the old geography of poverty, not the new. Effectively, 26% of the global aid budget goes to those 20 countries that are in greatest humanitarian need. That list of 20 includes Ukraine, which is the best funded humanitarian crisis in the world. If you take out Ukraine, you end up, I think, with 14% of the world's aid budget goes to those 19 poorest and most conflict-affected countries where very, very significant numbers of people live. So the inertia in the public policy system is very, very high. I just want to, I said there was a caveat or a coda or an additional element to this point I'm making about the interaction of conflict and extreme poverty. Of the 20 countries on our emergency watch list, 16 of them are in the top quartile of the Notre Dame Index of climate vulnerability. So there's a very stark correlation between the countries that have got the largest numbers of people in extreme poverty and conflict. There's also, and I would argue, the conflict is driving the extreme poverty. But let's be honest, there's more than a correlation between climate stress and conflict. Because one of the drivers of conflict is competition for resources, and one of the things that the climate crisis is generating is more resource stress, and that feeds through secondarily to more conflict. People sometimes say to me, do you work with climate refugees? And the truth is that there are two parts of the answer to that question. Number one, most of the people who move as a result of climate change because their livelihoods are no longer possible, they move within their own country. So they're not actually a refugee, they're not actually crossing a border. Secondly, for those who are suffering, who are moving as refugees as a result of conflict, climate is a secondary driver, not the main driver. So I generally don't talk about climate, quote unquote, climate refugees. So one obvious question, I don't have time to give you a proper PhD or even an MIT answer to this, but briefly, what's driving this shift in the geography of extreme poverty? I think 4 things, and I don't have time to go through them, but we can pick them up in questions if they're of interest. One, people often talk about a hyper-connected world. The world is more connected than it's ever been, but that means risks are more global than they've ever been. Just think about the pandemic. It's driven by hyperconnectivity. If you think about refugee flows, that's an example of connectivity. If you think about the economic shockwaves from the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, that's an example. It's because we're a connected world that the impact is so fast as well as so severe. Second point, the fragmentation of global politics. I'm not just referring here to the fact that the US administration takes such a dim view of its allies in Europe and in Asia. I think the fragmentation of global politics is more profound than that. People often say we're living in a multipolar world. By that, I think what they mean is there are more centers of power than either during the Cold War when there were two centers of power, or in the post-Cold War when there was effectively one center of power in the United States, so-called unipolar world. The trouble with that notion of a multipolar world is it suggests a degree of stability. It suggests you've got, I don't know, half a dozen different nodes of power. And that isn't the way I see this world of disorder today. In a way, if it was a multipolar world, you could say, well, if there are 6 countries that really count, they can really, there's an opportunity for governance there. I think we're in something much closer to what the Indian, he formerly worked for the UN, he is now an opposition politician in India. In 2006, Shashi Tharoor made a speech about what he called a multi-aligned world. There are much more than 6 countries that matter, and they're in different alignments on different issues, be they conflict issues, be they trade issues, be they climate issues, be they aid issues. So, second reason why I think we're seeing this disorder and the humanitarian suffering that results from it is the fragmentation of global politics. Thirdly, the growth of what I call impunity, the idea that rules are for suckers. And we see that in the war zones that we work in every day. We can come back to that. And fourthly, we featured this in our December 2025 emergency watch list. Profiteering from war economies is a growth industry. And it's not just arms supplies. I'm interested in that. I wish I knew more about it. We're going to try and do some more work on it. So, changing geography of poverty, very significant concentration in fragile and conflict states that are also climate stress states. By the way, in parenthesis, if you look at where does money for climate adaptation go, it's an inverse correlation between the poverty of the country and the amount of money that goes there. So some of the most climate vulnerable places in the world, like Somalia, get the least amount of money to help adapt to climate change. This new situation being driven by these 4 changes, drivers, all this means that the Iran war couldn't have come at a worse time. It couldn't have come at a worse time in Iran and in Lebanon, because, for obvious reasons, they're in the direct line of fire. It couldn't have come at a worse time for the indirect impact. 30% of the world, 33% of the world's fertilizer is meant to go through the Straits of Hormuz, as you've probably read. It's not going through. There's a humanitarian hub in Dubai, which is a global stocking point for humanitarian supplies. Even just the IRC, just the International Rescue Committee, we have $150,000 worth of supplies stuck in Dubai. So the global total is into the billions that's just stuck there that's needed. And then thirdly, the geopolitics of this conflict are empowering all sorts of bad actors. So the ricochet effects, I haven't been able to see the news today, but even if this ceasefire were to be observed in full, the ripple effects are very significant. I've got an article in Time magazine today about the domino effect. Those of you who are of my age, I'm afraid, will remember that, or will know that President Truman coined the idea of the domino theory to justify a series of American military interventions around the world in the early 1950s and beyond, on the grounds that if communism took root anywhere, it would take root, if not everywhere, in the neighboring states. And in the end, significantly, I think, because of the Vietnam War, the theory was discredited. I'm not trying to give new birth to the theory, but there is a domino effect when it comes to instability. Because the instability that starts in a war in Iran, or in a war in Sudan, or in a war in Afghanistan doesn't stop within those countries. I'd go as far as to say, for debating purposes, every civil war within a nation is also a regional conflagration. You can't give an audience to an ex-politician without him speaking for longer than he's invited or promises to speak for. So let me just finish by talking a little bit about what we do to try and mitigate the damage that we're seeing in this new context that we're working. The International Rescue Committee was founded by Albert Einstein in the 1930s to rescue Jews from Europe. Our first employee forged passports in Marseille in 1940. People like Marc Chagall were able, and a man called Wilfredo Lahm. Any of you who've been to New York recently, there's an exhibition of his paintings at the Museum of Modern Art. Marc Chagall, Wilfredo Lahm, 2,000 other persecuted people were able to escape from Nazi-occupied France because of our first employee, who was a man called Varian Fry, in 1939-40. Today we're a unique organization, really, because we're both an international humanitarian aid agency and a refugee resettlement and asylum support agency in the United States. There are no new refugees being allowed into the United States, but those who've arrived over the last 5 years are entitled to services, and we do that in 29 offices across the US. But we're also in 30 to 35 war-torn countries around the world. We built ourselves up to being a $1.5 billion organization. I don't know if there's anyone here from the business school, but we spent the last year dealing with a $400 million budget cut from the US government. So we're now a $1.1 billion organization rather than a $1.5 billion organization. 2 million clients lost their services, including 300,000 boys and girls in Afghanistan who counted on us and American aid to deliver them education. A health program in South Sudan for refugees from Sudan, also cut. But we have 12,000 employees working on high impact programs. We do about 20% of all the impact evaluations around the world. And actually we have partnerships, not with MIT sadly, but with other universities on these impact evaluations to make sure that we deliver programs of high quality. We have an innovation, what we call our research and development team of about 80. Today they're using AI to diagnose Mpox in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we're, I think, using technology in quite interesting ways, and we have a big drive on cost efficiency and cost effectiveness. I'm really proud. We've delivered 26 million vaccine doses over the last 3 years in 6 war-torn countries in East Africa at $2 a shot. And anyone if there's one thing, maybe one other thing that you remember from tonight, anyone who says to you, yeah, but the aid money's wasted, just say to them, for every $2 you can deliver a vaccine shot in a war-torn country if you're willing to work through community-based organizations. Obviously, it's a very dark time for the commitment of the United States as a country to international humanitarian aid. But the United States is not alone. Germany's reduced its aid budget. My friends and comrades in the UK government have reduced their aid budget. The European Union has not reduced its aid budget, interestingly enough, and the European Union is often criticized for being slow, but it has 7-year budgets, and it's just published its budget for 2028 to 2035, and it has a proposal for an increased budget. What's our recipe for this disorder that we see around the world? One, to focus resources where the needs are greatest. Sorry if that just sounds simplistic, but if you remember that statistic I gave you, only 25% of the world's aid budget goes to these 20 countries that have 90% of the humanitarian need. There's a mismatch there. Secondly, focus on proven programs that deliver outcomes, don't just check boxes for inputs. And we have a syndrome of bureaucracy that's created by many of those who are in charge of aid budgets that don't focus on outcomes. They much prefer to know the number of teachers who've been to a seminar than whether or not kids learned more. And so focusing on programs that have proven outcomes, and we can say more about that in the questions. Thirdly, I think this innovation agenda, which is not the same as a tech agenda, is a very big thing. We've innovated in the way we deliver services as well as in the kind of products and services that we deliver. And I think this, Einstein's gene of trying to rethink the way in which we do our business is absolutely key, because we're not going to go back to the kind of aid budgets that existed before. And then the final thing I'd say, obviously, if you want to get to the roots of these problems, humanitarian aid can staunch the dying, but you need politics to stop the killing. And we've thought about this quite hard, actually, whether or not there's room for an organization like us to be doing kind of track 2 diplomacy. And essentially, we've concluded there isn't. There isn't because it's a skill set, and there isn't because I think we'd end up putting ourselves in the middle of a political shouting match that would compromise the independence, the neutrality, the impartiality that's an important part of the humanitarian enterprise. But I'm very clear that my old world of politics and diplomacy needs to work much better if my new world of mitigating the circumstances of those in greatest need is not to be overwhelmed with the scale of the problem. So with apologies for speaking for longer than I promised or was invited to, very happy to be back and very happy to get your questions and comments.
David, is my microphone on?
Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to make a couple of, I found hurtful comments you made about me. You notice that he's wearing a beautiful tie, and I have no tie. And that the poster for the session has the same tie on him and no tie on me. And he did that to sort of show the elegance that he has. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, you said that $300 million was cut from your...
400.
$400 million. I also want to remind people here that this week, President Trump announced a defense budget for the United States of $1.5 trillion. Now, there is really a serious imbalance there. Sorry? So I'm only going to ask 3 questions. The first question is, how much of your funding going forward do you hope to get from individuals, private corporations, and how much from governments, percentage-wise? It's not so much in the money.
Yeah, I mean, we've gone from 10% private funding of a $500 million organization to 25% private funding, maybe 30%, of a $1.5 billion organization to 35% of a $1.1 billion organization. So I think we raise about $360 million a year in private support. And we need that to grow significantly. We were talking about this earlier, not because I'm saying let's fill the gap, because I think that's not the right, the world's moving on. We've got to meet needs as we see them, but to help us achieve more impact at greater scale. And when I said earlier about focusing our programs on those with proven outcomes, one of the dangers is that you end up with different people having their own boutique programs. Actually, the biggest thing we need to do is scale the proven programs. I can't give you a percentage because I don't want to give up on government funding. Now, I may have to give up on US government funding, but I'm not giving up on US government funding that goes through the UN and then comes to us. And I'm not giving up on US government funding that goes to the World Bank and then comes to us. And what I said at the beginning about the old development versus humanitarian equation not adding up anymore. The World Bank is a development bank, but it needs to make its mark in the fragile and conflict states because its mission is to help end extreme poverty on a livable planet. And if you ignore the 20 countries that are top of our list, it's a problem. So I would say we've got to max out on our private funding with as much flexibility and as little bureaucracy as possible. But I can't give you a figure because if I can increase our market share, if we can increase our market share from those government donors that are still in play, then the percentages will change.
My second question, I think, is going to be more confrontational. You argue that you don't get into the political side because it's a completely different
Skill set.
And you also have to be very careful to protect the people who work for you in these countries. But it seems to me that that's inevitably unsatisfactory. Because our problem is to get rid of the conflict. And that will help do better on that. But you're leaving that aside and saying it's too difficult a problem for me and the tie you wear, as opposed to actually saying, what are we doing about putting together a thoughtful international?
So it's a good challenge. I mean, remember, we're navigating local politics. We're saying to local armed groups who are in conflict with their own government, leave us alone to help the people under whose governance, who are living under your governance. And we're doing that as an organization that is headquartered in the US and could be freighted by politics if it's not careful. I think that means we've got to be, these humanitarian principles I mentioned, humanity, independence, impartiality, neutrality, they're quite demanding principles, actually, if you think about them. Because a lot of what happens in conflict is not a plague on both the houses. There's one side that is actually the aggressor and the other side that is the victim. But we have to sustain those four principles for a very simple reason. We need to say to both sides or all sides, we're not on anyone's side. So the shield for our workers, and you referred to this, who are locally hired, we're not sending people from New York or from Boston into Sudan in the main. We have 550 people working for us in Sudan. 542 of them, I think, are Sudanese. And so their own future is tied up with those principles. Now, what I would say, and I think we've been quite, I don't think we've been heroic, but I think we've been principled about this. We try to speak to the bigger politics without getting dragged into the bigger politics. And so if you hear what I said on CNN yesterday about what's happening in Lebanon, I don't get dragged into the politics, but I'm very clear about the consequences of the way in which the politics is going. And so I'm not saying that to say it's okay, we're doing enough, but I think we have our lane. And I had to say this to people a lot during the Gaza conflict in some ways is still going on, but there's a ceasefire to have made things better. I had to say to people, look, there's all sorts of opinions that I've issued in my previous life about the way the Middle East should go forward and what the rights of Palestinians should be, but that's separate from what I'm doing in my current life, which is to focus on the humanitarian lane alone. And so I think that's quite important.
I mean, I think that you're quite convincing and reasonable about it, but let me remind you, in the 70s, we went to Bosnia, and we couldn't do anything in Bosnia until we agreed that we're going to go in all the countries militarily to get some outcome which would bring peace in less.
Well, who was the we? The we was the U.S.
I'm immodest if I try.
The we was the U.S. government.
Yes.
Yeah. So
led by. We even had a few Brits. And a few,
yeah, but my point is, it's not the job of the U.S. government to be neutral, impartial, independent, or maybe independent. But I hope it stands for humanity. so it's a different we. That's my only point.
And I understand that. I'm just saying we need to have a common we to some extent. In any event, enough of that. I'm now going to come to my last question.
Yeah.
We're here at MIT, a relatively good university.
Brilliant.
Certainly good in comparison to that one up the street. But my question to you is, which are the university centers around the world which do work on this humanitarian issue in a, I'll use the word objective, knowledgeable, effective sense, so that we at MIT can learn how to do more? What are the successful schools?
Well, don't ignore the success in your own midst. So the Poverty Action Lab here, which traditionally focuses on development settings, but is actually, we're trying to do a partnership with them to bring some of their knowledge and techniques. I mean, that's a world-leading center, not just blowing smoke. That's a really world-leading center. Oxford has a remarkable center on refugees and migration, very impressive. Johns Hopkins has a impressive, I can't remember, slightly slipped my mind, jet lag from New York to Boston has got the better of me. I actually came by train, don't know, it's okay, but now the New School for Social Research do something very interesting with us. They second 12 researchers into different parts of our organization to help with our impact assessments and related things. That's great for them. They have a competition to do that. So I think there's different, I mean, the other thing I'd say is that the academic timetable is often not quite the same as the humanitarian timetable. And so that's something that needs working through.
Well, it's something that we should be thinking about here.
I hope, yeah.
And now it's time to turn to the audience. Please come forward with your questions. You've got to come to a microphone to speak. Be tough.
And brief. Do you want to take them in threes or?
No, one at a time, please.
Do we know
We'll
how to?
switch if it comes up.
Sorry, does anyone know how to turn this on?
It is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, so you'd think that. What?
Thank you. Thanks so much. This was really interesting. I'll just be really direct with my. Can you? Okay, I'll speak loudly. Thanks so much for your remarks. I'll just be really direct and short with my question. Do you think the global refugee resettlement infrastructure can survive continued opposition and attacks from the United States? I'm not just talking about defunding, but some of the political opposition at the UN, the expansion in third country resettlement agreements, et cetera.
So just so everyone knows, refugee resettlement is a particular program that takes what the UN believe to be the most vulnerable refugees. So it's widows, victims of torture, and it organizes for them to start a new life. And the US has been a leader in this. The average is 90,000 refugees a year have come to the US since 1980, the 1980 Refugee Act. And where's the lady who asked the question? Yeah. And it sounds like you know all this, but maybe the rest of the audience don't. And the Trump administration has essentially zeroed out the program. So that's when I said there's no new refugees coming to America. It's very weak in Europe, refugee resettlement. Our argument is it's right in and of itself, but it's also, if you don't offer people legal routes, the people who win are the people smugglers. I mean, it's an obvious equation. The only way you can get to Europe if the only way you can get to Europe is through a people smuggler, you'll go that way. Now, this year, the numbers of refugees resettled around the world it might not even be 25,000. So your question of can it survive, you could argue, has it been demolished? But I don't think but I think the idea of it is still very clear, and it still makes sense. Interestingly, the UK government is trying to bring in some refugee resettlement, albeit with very small numbers. So I think that I don't think it's dead, actually. I think that it's still got an important place, but 75% of the world's refugees are in poor countries, not in rich countries. And we've got to be careful not to substitute refugee resettlement for support for Bangladesh, which is hosting 1 million Rohingya. And so the durable solutions have to be in the countries next door to where there's conflict, not just on the other side of the world.
Sir.
At the end of World War II, I think America had a pretty good idea, the Marshall Plan, which helped rebuild countries that we fought against. We now are involved in a few wars or a few conflicts. Do you think there will be a moment in the future where we, either as the U.S. or as a collective, will have another Marshall Plan type moment to actually rebuild and ensure peace and humanitarian aid at a more comprehensive level?
Yeah. Well, here's the interesting thing. I mean, China has its version of the Marshall Plan. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative. It's not focused on a small number of countries, but it's in scale, it's pretty big. So can countries mobilize for big projects internationally? The answer is obviously yes. Now, are you American?
I am,
Yeah.
yes.
So maybe you'll be better able to answer the following than me. The way I would reframe your question is, does it take 2 world wars within 50 years to generate a generation of Americans, or 2 generations of Americans, who think about enlightened global responsibility? Because God help us that we have 2 more world wars to generate that kind of feeling. But I mean, I've lived in New York for 12 years, but I'm still a foreigner. And I wouldn't claim to be able to speak to the psychology of the country. But you're a continent. You've got neighbors north and south who are peaceful and would like to be your allies. You've got oceans on each side. So the temptations of thinking that you're not the enlightened self-interest is somehow not needed. That temptation, just hang on one second, that temptation is high. I just want to say one other thing. You see, this is where, I mean, obviously the phrase America first has a very negative history. But you don't want the answer to American isolationism to be America second. And I would argue that what American administrations did after the Second World War didn't put America second. America benefited from enlightened sustenance, anchoring of a global system. That's the argument I think there has to be won, but it obviously has to be won by Americans in your politics, and obviously it exists. I mean, Brexit was a disaster for the UK, and in a way spoke to some of the same issues.
Thank you.
Sorry for the long answer. I know, I'm sorry. I apologize.
Please, please.
I'm not used to speaking in Twitter-length answers, so I apologize.
So you mentioned that globalization has exacerbated some of the worst crises, but at the same time, like, many countries managed to immensely improve the welfare of the people through both opening up the world and domestic economic liberalization. Consider Narasimha Rao's India or Deng's China. And do you think that the way that countries responded to the beginning of a truly globalized world post-Cold War significantly affected their present-day humanitarian outcomes?
It's a really good question. I'm sorry if I didn't make it clear. What I was trying to say is that globalization has brought new risks, but those risks are not being managed. There was an economist at this university, Charles Kindleberger, who diagnosed the crisis of the 1930s as the fact that the declining power of the UK was not replaced by the rising power of the US. Essentially, we've got a Kindleberger trap on a range of global issues that aren't managing the global consequences of globalization.
Please.
Thank you.
To press you slightly on the point you were talking about of the political role of humanitarian organizations. I wondered if you personally or your organization think about like what role humanitarian organizations have in propping up non-state actors or state actors as well that are engaging in conflict, and if so, how you balance that on the ground?
So I think so would an example of your question be, if you're giving education to boys and girls in Afghanistan, does that prop up the Taliban, would be the sort of argument. First of all, our mandate is to help people independent of their administration, but I would say this to you as a political reflection. I can't think of many situations, I can't think of any situations where the services that we've provided have made populations love their government. I don't want to be naive about it, but people who are living under in an oppressive situation, they decide who's oppressing them. If you mitigate their situation and give them opportunity and support, I don't think it makes them like their government. You can almost, remember, the opposite would be, well, by educating these people, you're if anything, you're creating the opposite. You might be creating aspiration for more. So it is something worth thinking about. Because we have a needs-based mandate, I think that the implications for us as an organization are pretty clear. But as it happens, I don't think it's as tough a dilemma as might be feared. Thanks a lot.
John.
Quick question. Does this interest in humanitarian aid exist? Does it resonate in both the private sector and the government sector in Asia? And I'm talking broadly from Japan all the way down.
Japan is a massive development donor. They've historically been very reticent about humanitarian aid. They've been more on the development side. They've got a lot of thinking to do. South Korea, very interesting example. We've been working to raise funds there in the last 3 years. 45,000 South Koreans donate to the International Rescue Committee every month. And it's going up significantly. China, much more reticent on the humanitarian front, although they did give $100 million to Gaza, which I thought was interesting. But generally, they say we're a developing country, we're not in the humanitarian aid business.
Given the area of reduced financial support from governments, is there a movement or a desire among humanitarian organizations to consolidate their efforts and have fewer places for contributions to go?
M&A is not well developed in our sector, I think it's fair to say. And if anything, there's a desire for more local organizations, which of course multiplies the number of agencies that are in play. You'd think there would be some market rationalization, but I haven't seen much evidence of it. What we're trying to do, we have very strict entry and exit criteria, one of which is if someone else is doing the job, we don't go there. And one of the things I've learned is there's very little evidence of people tripping over each other. I'm often asked, well, does two NGOs end up in the same place doing the same thing? Actually, the way we organize ourselves means that local level, that very rarely happens. I think we've got to try, one thing I didn't have a chance to mention or should have mentioned, the reactive nature of humanitarian effort can be seen as inevitable, or you can stop and say, hang on, we can predict climate events. And we've actually done some good impact evaluations to prove the obvious point. If you give people aid before the flood strikes, they'll come out of it better than if you give them cash after the flood strikes. I think we could make the sector more effective and efficient if we became far more anticipatory. But there's only one government in the world, which is Germany, which pledges 5% of its aid to be anticipatory finance, and even they don't meet the target. So I think sorry, that wasn't quite what you asked about, but it came into my mind. Thanks a lot.
Hi, so I have a question that maybe might be a personal question even, but one humanitarian to another, and I work for Oxfam, is how do you manage the heaviness of it all? And I'm assuming there's a lot that keeps you up at night, and that takes a toll on one person's mental health, but how do you persist and keep at it?
Thank you for asking. I have it relatively easy compared to people who are on the front line, I have to say. And so I don't want to paint myself in any kind of heroic posture, but thank you for asking. There is I tell you what I've learned, and I don't know if this aligns with your experience working for Oxfam. When I was in politics, I used to argue that hope leads to action. And now that I'm in the humanitarian movement, I say that action leads to hope. And so you might think, well, hang on, going to Lebanon was a bit risky, but well, we take our security seriously, not by having guns, but by having intelligence. But actually seeing what our teams are doing for people who've been displaced from the Bekaa Valley or from southern Lebanon, I mean, that can't but make you hopeful. So I think if you're asking how do I, first of all, I'm a great believer if you're not, as long as you're learning something, you'll enjoy doing something, and it's worthwhile to do it. But I do think this action creates hope is very much my philosophy.
So the way we communicate has shifted.
Speaker to the microphone, please.
Oh, sorry. The way we communicate has shifted massively in the past decade. I just wondered how you think that change in communication has played into the kind of disorder you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and in America, people often say that's a great question, and often it means they don't know the answer. So that is a great question. I think there's some evidence of direct impact. And if you look at the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya in Myanmar in 2017-18, hate was being propelled at extraordinary speed and did find its way into extreme violence. That's a bit of an outlier case in its directness and in its, and it's maybe not what you were asking about. I think that the second thing I would say is that when I was in politics, people used to say, a lie is halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. And now, a lie is 100 times around the world before the truth figures out that it's being lied about. And I think that is very, very corrosive of dialogue and of democracy in a really profound way. Just a sec, John. So I think that's important in this. And then the third, sorry. It's not like there's going to be a stroke of lightning at 6 o'clock and we're all going to get sort of blown up.
How do you know?
Because it's still tea time. And then the third thing that I would say is that in a poll in February last year, 89% of Americans, 84% of Republicans, and 94% of Democrats said they would support 1% of the federal budget going on foreign aid. And as you might know, before the cuts, about 1% of the American federal budget went on foreign aid, but a majority of the population thought that 20% went on foreign aid. And the reason I raise that is we have to do a miles better job at mobilizing the truth about what we do. And I think the way is not just for me to make speeches, it's for our clients to be speaking about what the $2 dose of vaccine means to them. So I think, sorry for the long answer, I'm not trying to be difficult, but I think I don't think we've cracked that question, but I think it's a really important one.
Please.
Oh, great. Former student of Professor Deutch, so I'll also challenge you a little bit here. So how do you prevent
Challenge
humanitarian...
him or me?
Sorry?
No, challenge me.
Oh, I can't challenge you. I've already challenged you enough
Thank
in
you.
class. How do you prevent humanitarian language such as fragility, civil war, political failure from depoliticizing crises that are in fact heavily shaped by external intervention and asymmetric power? And if humanitarian actors recognize that framing itself can obscure responsibility, do you see any role for organizations like yours in pushing more actively for diplomacy or political accountability, if not formal mediation, like you said earlier?
Well, I honestly think, if you read that emergency watch list I referred to, I honestly think our team did a really nice job on that. They didn't just go into our own vocabulary, and we called out profiteering from war. We advocated for the suspension of the veto in the UN Security Council in cases of mass atrocity. We said that impunity was being foisted on people around the world. So, but it was humanitarian because we were speaking to what we see in our work. And so I think that's I don't give us a plus on everything, but on this thing. I think we've not just gone into the sort of NGO speak, I think, because you're right to warn about it.
I visited Rwanda over spring break, and the country currently is marking 32nd anniversary of ending the genocide in Rwanda. So the country is doing great now, but many people still live in trauma after the genocide. So my question is that as a humanitarian organization, what would you do to help people with mental health issues, especially experiencing like war, genocide?
Yeah, so two very brief points. One, I mentioned that we have entry and exit criteria. We left Rwanda because it's no longer a crisis, a country where there's crisis or the threat of crisis. Secondly, mental health in humanitarian work is as marginalized as it is in the mainstream world, if you like, or in non-conflict places. But some of the results are extraordinary. So in our programs for kids who are victims of war, which I know more about than for adults, remarkable progress in addressing trauma faced by kids. And it's often not labeled mental health program. It might be an education program for social and emotional learning, but it delivers on the mental health front as well as on the academic front.
Rwanda was a U.S. failure, U.S. military failure.
You spoke a little bit about the mismatch between where humanitarian conflicts occur and where extreme poverty exists and where money actually flows. So my question is, in that context, what policy changes are required to most aptly correct that mismatch?
Yeah, nice to hear British voices. Although I met a Tottenham supporter earlier who's worried about their match on the weekend. I think kind of what I rushed through at the end. One, if 60% of the world's extreme poor live in fragile and conflict states, 60% of the aid budget should go to fragile and conflict states. Secondly, within those states, it needs to go to the fragile and conflict-affected populations, because Nigeria is a fragile and conflict state, but large parts of Nigeria are doing very well. Northern Nigeria is not doing very well. Thirdly, invest in proven programs. Fourthly, drive efficiency and cost effectiveness. And don't be ashamed of that. My $2 vaccine shot speaks to that. I think if we did that, we'd reorient the system.
So you correctly mentioned hatred as one of the root causes for wars and conflicts. And I think what feeds into hatred is the wrong ideology, whether it can be religious or different ideologies. Being an Iranian, I went through this brainwash by religion myself during my primary school, so I'm very well aware of the impact of wrong ideology, what hatred it can create. So my question is, are we doing enough to counter this wrong ideology in the brains of young kids, especially in those countries governed by religious forces?
I might have to plead the Fifth Amendment on this question. I mean, first of all, whenever anyone asks me, "Are we doing enough about X?" I always say no, because you can always do more. Secondly, it's not only in, I don't know exactly how you put it, religious countries where kids have got, where there are issues. I mean, the point about social media that was raised earlier, the way, what's going into the minds of under sevens is really, I mean, the digital generations now are growing up with completely different stimulus than previous generations. I think it's not like before TV and then having TV. It's a whole new, with no gatekeepers really. So I think that's the thing. And then thirdly, do I worry about it? Yes. I worry about, I mean, I was in Syria, I said last week, and I talked to a family about what what was in their textbooks and how they're trying to change their textbooks. And there's generations of Syrians who've been brought up to think that, or been told that all sunlight came out of the Assad family. And so, is that a problem? Yeah, it's a massive problem.
Are you waiting to ask a question, ma'am?
Yes, just.
You're going to ask the last question.
I am. So, in closing, you were saying that there is a new disorder, right? We could potentially claim that the whole system has been collapsing for a while and it finally collapsed last year or earlier this year. It's been collapsing, right? What is the way of going forward? You're mentioning focusing on programs that work. That's something that we heard before. But how can one function, do business, if there's no order, no framework, and we don't know where we are going?
So, I mean, first of all, there are degrees of disorder. So I don't think of it as standing versus collapsed. I think it's you can have more or less order or more or less disorder, and we've got growing disorder. Secondly, I don't believe that investing in well-functioning programs is the answer to global disorder. It's the answer to humanitarian suffering. Thirdly, to your question, I would say we've got a globalized world of global risks, but we don't have global systems to manage it. We're not going to get a single global system. In a multi-aligned world that I talked about, the future, as far as I can see, is coalitions of the willing on different issues. And more countries taking more responsibility in whatever alliance they can find. I mean, I spent time as Secretary of State for the Environment before I was Foreign Minister. And the UN climate process works with everyone having a veto. So that means it doesn't work. But that can't mean that 50 countries, 100 countries, 150 countries who want to do something on climate shouldn't do it. And so I become a big believer in a sort of multilateralism. Multilateralism sounds like a single system, and that was the dream of the post-war pioneers. I don't want to give up on the UN Charter and its related instruments. I think they're the basis. But I think that we're not going to have a single system. We need multiple coalitions of the willing. It's going to be overlapping. It's going to be messy. But its action leads to hope.
There is hope then.
Definitely.
I want you to join me in thanking David Miliband for a most interesting.
Thank you.